Get underway. Tēnā tātou katoa. We seek wisdom, understanding, insights into the views and circumstances of others, strength to seek what we believe in, humility to accept the combined decisions of others, patience, good humour at all times, tolerance and courtesy while working in the best interests of our community. We have, first of all, apologies. I have apologies for Councillor Sharon Stewart for absence and apologies from Councillors Bartley and Collins for lateness. So I move that we accept the apologies. Do I have a seconder from Councillor Wayne Walker? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Declaration of interest. Are there any members of the governing body that have any interest that they need to declare on any item on the agenda today? If not, thank you. Confirmation of the minutes. We have one set of minutes to confirm of the 28th of March. I move that we confirm those minutes. I have a seconder, Councillor Casey. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Petitions. We have received no petitions for this meeting. Public input. I've received 3 requests. 2 have been declined, both on the same grounds that the matter lies under the delegation of a committee of the whole, one for the Planning Committee and one for the Environment and Community Committee. And there is one request that has been approved, and I'll invite Viv Hart, Chief Executive of Viv Beck. Your job has captured you, Viv. I'm sorry about that. Welcome to the committee. Viv's here today to talk about the paper that we have under item number 8, I think it is, which is the funding of the increase in costs for the City Rail Link. Viv, welcome along. Thank you for the great job you do on Heart of the City, and you've got 5 minutes, and then open it up for some questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. You're all aware that we represent major ratepayers in the city centre who also make a significant contribution to GDP. And clearly this project delivers major opportunity, but it also does have risk. And our reason for presenting today is to really help inform your debate. And can I also say that my comments are always genuinely in the interests of a great outcome for the city. I'm very interested in the smart leadership model around the ecosystem of central government, local government and private sector, actually not-for-profit as well at times, and how they work together to achieve great results. So they're not personal, but I would like to make some points today about the funding paper. What I thought I'd do in the interest of time, because 5 minutes isn't long, is I'm just going to pose some questions about each of the recommendations, which I hope will be useful for you in your debate. So if I start quickly with the first one, is obviously a fairly big decision, approve 2.2 billion of funding. You will obviously discuss the rigour of the analysis. Our question really relates to the risk for more cost and how that risk will be mitigated and signalled. So I think, obviously the market, this is public information, and I'm interested in how that risk will be mitigated, because clearly that any delays or funding blowouts have impacts for our stakeholders. I would like to pose a few questions about the source of funding. A likely blowout to CRL costs has been signalled for some time, and the question really is, have other models been explored? Because as an outsider looking in, it has seemed a little bit like there was $500 million to find in a week. And that might be unfair, but I think that's certainly how it has appeared, as a sort of a bit of a snatch and grab at options to see how we could fill that gap. So the questions really are, has another funding partner been considered? Obviously, people like Superfund have interests in things like light rail. Light rail has some delays, and that's a question. Looking at Crown Infrastructure Partners, private sector, iwi. Certainly those are questions that we would be interested to know the answers to, whether other funding partners have been considered and sought. And could, as part of an alternative model, that debt that is such a big focus in the paper, that debt ratio, could that be moved off balance sheet, as has happened in another project recently? Now, aside from political sensitivities, and I'm not wading into, I don't want to wade into political issues, but it would be interesting to see an objective analysis around other assets. We're told that we can't do this and we can't sell those, but it would be interesting to see an objective analysis on some of the other assets like airport shares, the port. Has Albert Street been considered as an opportunity? Could we change the timing of other projects? Do we have a strategy around potential future increases? Those potential risks, the risk around future CRL costs. Certainly we wouldn't want to see a situation like the last week. Once again, as I say, that's an outsider looking in. And remembering, those are the questions we get. In terms of the third recommendation, progressing a strategy to assess future off-street parking, a well-considered review is clearly a pretty sensible thing to be thinking about. I think the problem is this came across as fairly predetermined when we heard about this a week and a half ago. Horse before the cart in terms of potential savings before we'd done the strategy. And that rose questions because even in the paper it talks about Auckland Transport doing investigations and developing a strategy, and this isn't a dig at Auckland Transport by any means, but we've also got Auckland Council talking about the importance of car parking buildings as we look at making radical changes in the city, both in terms of pedestrianisation and innovations around how you might use that space, because obviously once it's gone, it's gone. So the recommendation that we have seen still appeared to have some risk because it obviously needs to be a holistic approach across the council group. It needs to think of those wider strategic benefits. It needs to consider accessibility for all Aucklanders, because I think it would be unrealistic to suggest that by 2023 everybody will get here by public transport. And also there's no public consultation, and a slightly disturbing thing in the paper was that it was kind of like we've put up options that don't need consultation, because that's obviously what you could do quickly, but the reality is a decision this big, $500 million, is surely something that needs some full consideration. Once again, I say that I haven't been privy to that detail, but that's a question looking in. Finally, that staff continue to get the best arrangements with the Crown. Now, that's an interesting one, and I'm sure there have been a lot of discussions. Obviously, we don't hear a lot about that, except they can't change the funding agreements and sponsorship arrangements. It's 50-50, can't change. But surely the discussion around a different funding model could be an option. And it just seems, once again, looking in, these people are elected representatives as well, and they have a responsibility to Auckland and its future. And we don't see that. We've observed through America's Cup deliberations, we've observed through the port discussion, we've observed through City Rail Link, which is clearly not just a city centre project. We've observed things that actually, to be perfectly honest, don't fit what we think is the smart leadership model that we need for the city because of the major challenges. It's a concern, but also a big opportunity. And I guess what I wanted to leave you with is that I guess if there is debate, it would be good to be debating some of those points, because how that model works between central government, local government, private sector is fundamental to this. And I would like to think we were moved away from, oh, well, we'll take some money from here and here and here. That could be unfair, but these are strategic decisions, as you know. And I think the respect for Auckland Council, I want nothing more than people to say to me, they're doing a terrific job and we're in good hands. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Thank you very much for that, Viv. You've raised a lot of questions, and I hope you're able to stay for the presentation that'll be made by the City Rail Link Limited. We've got Sir Brian Roach here as chair and Sean Sweeney as the CEO. And a lot of those questions have been put to us in workshops, put by us in workshops and answered. I just want to say, in terms of the ongoing risk, what we have at this point is far more certainty than we had when this contract or this cost was estimated in 2014. So it's based on half of the cost being known, because there is now a tender that's been accepted, and it's based on international peer review separately by two international organisations. And I'm persuaded that the job has been thoroughly done by CRRL, and the estimate we now have is an estimate that we can far better rely on. What we don't know, we don't know. You can never rule out further cost escalations. But, for example, we've got we knew we had to future-proof it, and I think you've supported that in the past, and we knew that we didn't have enough money set aside originally for contingency and escalation, and that's been increased, and those two things by themselves add up to more than half of the cost. But what I want to do is just give you the chance now to answer any questions that members of the governing body may have. First question is in the name of Councillor Wayne Walker.
So just have a question that goes to the issue you're raising around parking. What projections has your group got of the increase in residential population in the CBD and the increase in workers in the CBD over time?
The projection is that the residential population could double in 10 years. Oh, the projection...
Double in 10 years?
Yeah, yeah. And I've seen projections out to about 160,000 workers, but over 30 years, if you look at a graph of growth and employment, city centre far exceeds any other part of Auckland.
Just to clarify around the increase in workers.
I'd need to get the time frame for you.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I just forecast that I will be asking that question of some officers later.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Rosscliffe.
Thanks, Viv. Our relationship with the government is a multifaceted one, and it's kind of, I take the analogy of a lemon tree. I mean, there's a whole lot of ripe lemons there, and ATAP is a huge lemon that we're trying to work through, plus a number of other projects. Does Heart of the City understand in our relationships with the government, we could try and squeeze this lemon, being the CRL, harder and harder and harder, but our strategy, would you agree, or do you think it's a sensible thing, our strategy being to try and shake the tree and get a few more lemons off it, instead of just focusing on one that's already dropped to the ground?
No, I understand that, and we followed the debate around the transport. What I'm concerned about, actually, is that we talk about special purpose vehicles and we talk about private-public partnerships and we talk about all these things. What I would have hoped is that there might have been some discussion around some alternative models, and that would need discussion with the Crown. So I'm not suggesting we're not privy to those conversations. I'm just asking the question. We're digging into the sort of, in a way, the money box of how we can pay $500 million. And what I'm posing is, are there other discussions we could be having with the Crown around other ways? And I'm sure you're having them, but we're hearing about these different models. It would be good to understand how that could apply with something like City Rail Link.
Follow-up question. Does Heart of the City see the urgency for this to be, because you mentioned that maybe we should be going out and consulting and stuff, but we really need to make a decision now, not in 12 months' time.
Yeah, no, I understand that. What I was talking about with consulting was around the way this was presented 10 days ago was that we could sell off a few non-strategic assets, like car parks. What I'm saying is, because there are factors around those car parks that actually do make, they might not be technically classified as strategic assets, but the circumstances of the city have changed to a point where they, really are quite strategic assets. And what I was saying is that, the way the paper was presented, a decision could have been made without any form of input, even from people like us that do perceptions research and have another piece. And that comes back to that leadership model. Have everybody being able, like people like us, being able to give input to discussions like that, so we don't have to come in behind and say, have you thought about this? So I think that was more around making sure that they're well-considered pieces of work, which, as I understand, you're actually proposing now that a review will be done, which is a sensible thing to do. But I understand the urgency around the funding. Yeah. I guess what would have been good would have been to know, well, what would be good would be to know the answers to those questions about other options for funding.
If I can just reply briefly to that, the urgency is that we had a competitive tender process.
understand.
Where were really one major company pulled out, which created challenges for us and delayed the process. We're working in an environment where there's now $230 billion worth of construction contracts out there and work underway compared to 80 billion 2 years ago. If we cannot confirm with the company that has been chosen by a very good and competitive tendering process within the next month, they won't hang around. They won't wait till we examine other models or go through a consultation process to find out what other ways we can find money. We need to confirm this contract now, or we run the risk of losing it. And at the very least, we run the risk of further delaying it, and I'm sure the Heart of the City doesn't want to delay it. So those points need to be taken into account. Therefore, we looked at things that could be done without the statutory requirement where we had to go back to our public and go through a 3, 4, 5 month process, because that would have killed the tender.
I understand that, and I've read the paper in detail. I guess the question remains, though, that wasn't surely just a week-long piece of work. I mean, you know, so I guess I'm saying, hasn't there been time to do some of these things before this? And let's make sure we're not in this position again.
Yeah, and obviously during the period of time before the tenders were received, we anticipated there would be cost escalation. You'd have to be blind not to anticipate that.
Yeah.
Everybody in the community anticipated that, and our finance team did work through how are we going to deal with this? And this is the conclusion of work and thinking over a long period of time, confirmed by the letter we received, I think, on the 12th of April. Can I now come to Councillor Kathy Casey, please?
I'll get the Mayor to keep me right on this. Viv, you said at the beginning of your talk that you weren't political, this was not, you weren't entering into a political debate. But halfway through, you suggested to us that we look at selling one of our strategic assets, which is the airport shares. No, you did.
No, I didn't say that.
You didn't say that.
No. What I said was, I appreciate, aside from political sensitivities, it would be good to understand an analysis of different assets. So all we hear is, you know, we can't sell this, we can't sell that. It would be interesting to understand an objective analysis. That's what I'm asking for.
But you did say the selling of the airport shares, didn't you?
No, I said assets like airport
Right, you
shares.
did say that, thank you.
Yes.
So my question to you is, when you put that on the table as something we should look at, are you speaking personally? Are you speaking on behalf of the members of Heart of the City or on behalf of the board of Heart of the City?
I'm speaking on behalf, I'm here speaking on behalf of the Heart of the City. What I'm saying is they are assets, and I don't think it's unreasonable for the public to understand the opportunities around different assets. Political decisions may be made that you can't do these things. I'm just posing them as...
The airport shares is a strategic asset. It's protected in perpetuity for the people of Auckland. To say that we should consider selling that is an overtly political statement.
No, I didn't intend that with my statement. I didn't intend it, no. What I'm asking for is a strategic review, a strategic assessment of the options. And I questioned why parking buildings would be called I mean, I understand the technical term, but I guess I'm just trying to understand the benefits, the costs and benefits of different assets. I certainly wasn't trying to suggest anything should be sold. I was trying to understand the opportunities.
Okay. Councillor Daniel Newman.
Good morning, Viv. Thank you very much for being here. My questions go to understanding the retail off-street car parking market in the CBD. So can you confirm, beyond Auckland Council, whether there are any other major players other than Tournament and Wilson's, and can you just elaborate on the extent of the market share that those two providers of off-street parking provide?
Yeah. Have you got that, Tanya, have you got that detail here? We know that we provide 17%, or about 20%. The council off-street is, well, 17% is the figure I've got, but I think council's is about 21. So the majority is privately owned.
And can you elaborate in relation to the any information you have about the behaviour of those providers of off-street parking in relation to short stay parking in the CBD? Do you have a breakdown of the proportion of short stay versus lease provided by those car parking providers?
We do have it, but I haven't got that at my fingertips, no.
Okay.
I do know that the perception of the public is that parking is expensive in the city centre. And even though actually Auckland Transport does make a competitive offering, it's also a perception that parking is we know the demand is there because the on-street parking has gone, goes up because of the demand, but the perception is that, there's a shortage of parking and it's expensive.
Okay, I've got one final question because ironically the information I asked of you isn't provided to us either. So the last question that I had really relates to would you agree that in relation to mode share into the CBD during the morning peak, even with the growth in public transport movement, mode share includes about just under half of all commuters into the CBD are actually travelling in by private motor vehicle.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, I missed the beginning of the question.
Would you agree with the assumptions that Auckland Transport has been providing that around about half of all of the vehicle movements in the morning peak into the CBD, the mode share is actually private vehicle?
It's slightly, I think the latest figures were slightly under half private vehicle, yeah.
Very, very
I
substantial.
do agree with that.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Just as a supplementary to that, based on the figures you gave us earlier, that the residential population is going to double, which means we're going to need a whole lot more pedestrian space, and there'll be less space for cars in town. And secondly, if we're going to increase our workforce up to 160,000 coming in, would you agree actually there's no more room on the motorways to bring more cars in peak hour, and what we're going to have to do is focus on much improved public transport systems such as the CRL?
Absolutely. I mean, let's be really clear. We totally support public transport. The point we're making is that realistically, not everyone will be able to get in from around Auckland in the next 3 or 4 years by public transport. So, and there will always be people that need to come in because they have, they've got kids or grandparents or mobility, or they've got to get around the city, So I think realistically, we're just trying to make sure accessibility remains open. I mean, a good analogy probably is NZME yesterday. They've launched now premium, you pay a subscription, but there's a website that you can go in free if you can't afford it. So it's about accessibility for all. That's what we're talking about, to make sure those needs are met. And also, the unknown in all of this is that innovation, because we can't, the current figures don't tell us that, but the reality is what could be done in that space could fundamentally change the way the city centre operates. That's why we think it is actually a strategic asset, and that's why we were concerned when we heard it's a non-strategic asset. Now, I understand, Councillor Casey, there's technicalities around those choice of words. All we're looking for is objective analysis of options, that's all.
Thank you. Councillor Christabi.
Thanks, Viv. So just in terms of, you're really asking us, we're considering a $500 million shortfall on our side, and your concern is around 10% of that, the 50. Am I correct in that? The balance you're not examining, you're examining that 50, which is related to the possibility of it coming out of a licence or a concession or possible.
Yes, I mean, we had some questions about the recommendations. We were concerned about the outtake initially, that it was a sale or lease. We understand that that has been amended, but we also felt that that was sort of a little bit horse before the cart. And applying a saving before you know what your strategy is, because there also may be investment required in realising some of those other benefits. So we were concerned about applying a figure to it, because really it's a calculated guess, I would have thought.
Okay, so just generally, are you now, we're 10 days on, and things have changed. Are you generally in agreement with recommendation C as it's written? Because I'm hearing that it does reflect what you've been asking for, which is to progress the strategy. It's not conclusive, and it signals that there's governing body decisions to be made.
Yes, and I guess all I'd say is it does need to be a holistic approach, needs to consider accessibility for Aucklanders and the innovation and alternative use of space.
So access for everyone, climate, future, public realm demands,
Has to
all
be
of that,
included.
and that's encompassed in that.
Yeah.
We don't say it, but that's assumed in there. You're satisfied with that?
Have I got the wording in front of me? Where is it?
It's to progress a strategy, and look, I can assure you, we've had these discussions, that it does include all of that.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
And that includes the option of selling the concession pretty much the way Sky City has to Macquarie, where the car parks remain, they're in the same place, the ownership remains, but you sell the concession. I think that concession was worth 200 million to Sky City. So that's one of the options that's being looked at. Won't actually affect the availability of car parking at all, and arguably if you sell a concession, you can set terms so that the costs aren't exorbitant either.
So as long as that, as long as the rigour and the analysis was there, so it didn't need to be consulted because you were losing it, you know, because if you were going to just sell off an asset, I think it would need some consultation, especially one that affects the public.
I think this process itself will be subject.
Yeah.
It's a thorough investigation, so it'll look at all of the things that you've expressed concern about, and you'll have some input to that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, great.
great. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. Viv, thank you for coming today. And may I also say thank you to Heart of the City for the long-standing commitment that there has been to public transport. It was the advocacy from Heart of the City that saw the original Britomart contract cancelled that would have had a below-ground bus car park and 5 layers of car parking, meaning that the CRL could never have happened. So you have had the vision and the foresight since, you know, the late 1990s to ensure that we could advance the CRL. So I want to recognise that. So what you're telling us today is not to delay the CRL, because as I see it, the CRL has been a project that you have long championed. But what I would like to know is, within your experience and the research that you've done since the 1990s, what is international experience and best practice in terms of council and the retention of car parks? What cities have you looked at? What have you explored in terms of possibility and different uses?
Well, to be honest, until about 10 days ago, this wasn't actually on our radar, because we were starting the discussions around utilising the airports differently, the car parking buildings differently. And so, and we would have expected to have done some serious work around that. So all the involvement we've had, well, certainly in my time, has been around recognising the value of the car parks, recognising that Auckland Transport in isolation might do a different analysis than, say, a holistic view across the council. And we've been concerned around accessibility to the city centre, but we haven't been considering, as we haven't with other assets, we haven't been considering what those options might be and doing further. We do a lot of research, but that isn't one we've been researching recently.
So it's more the ad hocery, if you like.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's what happens when something like that hits you. You jump into action, have a look at the impact, come in behind and make, you know, try to get some action, but that's not the way we want to work, and that goes back to the point that I made at the beginning. Ideally, rather than a piece of work happening independently, the different people who've been involved in these conversations would provide input. We're happy to release research that we've got, and we'd get better results. So that is the smart model I'm talking about, exactly that.
I really appreciate that. And I think you'll probably see that the attachments, which have the original recommendations, have actually been improved in what might be being put forward today. The other thing I want to quiz you on is your view about our relationship with central government. You seem to imply that Auckland Council has really become a bit of an ATM for central government with the different projects we've been required to sponsor that have national benefits. Would you like to expand further on that?
Well, once again, I'm an outsider looking in, and I understand that I'm not party to the discussions, but remembering most people out there are just looking in. And I had great hope that we would continue to develop relationships, that people feel that there's a real understanding and working together across the different sectors to deliver great things for the city. And I guess I haven't seen a lot of that. I mean, I do understand there's work going on around the ATAP and the transport, and that's terrific, and we are supportive of that, and we've been publicly supportive of that. But you don't hear that much. You know, you observe, you see discussions, you think, goodness me, there doesn't seem to be the respect there that I would hope. And all I'm saying is I think Auckland is a pretty significant player in the country. And I would have thought there were opportunities. Without trying to criticise what's happening now, I would think there are opportunities for how that relationship works and what can be achieved through it. And I think the same with private sector and the same with the not-for-profit sector.
We haven't really been as tactical as we might have been.
Well, I guess what I'd probably say is we have been tactical. We could probably look to be a little bit more strategic overall.
Thank you.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay, next question, Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Viv. I note you are the representative of the businesses of the Central Business District of Auckland, the CBD of New Zealand, some say. So I would just like your advice in regard to the business aspects of this proposal. Would you consider it sound business practice? And I'm aware that not only are you a business advisor, but you're a businesswoman yourself. Would you consider it sound business practice to sign off on a major cost escalation estimate on behalf of your shareholders without a very careful line-by-line examination of those costs?
No.
Second, thank you. Second question, in regard to the question of car parking, which obviously is of keen concern to your organisation in Auckland, off-street parking. Given that even in particular this project, CRO, which originally was meant to be completed by 2021, will not be completed until 2024 at this stage, and that light rail, which has been talked about for quite a few years now, has not even got to the business case stage. Given there won't be any significant public transport improvements, quantum improvements in the CBD for the next 5 years, do you think it wise to hand over or outsource or alienate council-owned or AT-owned car parking buildings, and given that the likelihood of doing that will mean a major cost increase for off-street parking in the CBD?
No, and that's why we jumped into action when we saw that news come out. I think what I'm hearing from the conversation now is that a proper review of options will be considered, but I think it also needs to take account of where the city will be at that time, and we have to include accessibility for all. So sure, the game will change over the next 3 to 4 or 5 years, but it's not going to change completely. So I think any analysis has to be thorough and consider accessibility for all.
Just one last question, please. In regard to the City Rail Link and the second major cost escalation we're dealing with today, do you think it prudent business practice to sell any income-earning asset, given that the current price escalation is an estimate, and that there's no guarantee it won't go higher? Do you think it's wise for any organisation members of Heart of the City or even the council to sell income-earning assets in this particular environment?
Well, I have to say, I think there is concern around the fact there's potential for blowout, and you might not have been here when I said I think that that needs to be considered quite carefully in terms of how that risk is mitigated. I think the decision around selling any income-bearing asset depends, I think, on the analysis. And so what I said was, with any assets, it would be interesting as a business person to understand those assets and understand the options around them. And I did say, political sensitivities aside, because if there is something that can't be sold, people understand that. They just want to understand what the reasons are and what is in the mix. That's all I'm really asking for. But I think there will be different opportunities to look at different assets, and it's probably hard to give you one specific answer. But I think what I have heard today is that it won't be a wholesale, certainly not at this point, a wholesale sale, and that's what we wanted to achieve.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Josephine Bartley.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. Thank you, Viv, for your presentation. I just wanted to know your thoughts around what Sky City have done. I mean, maybe they know something that we don't know. So, interested in your thoughts there.
I don't know the absolute terms, the commercial terms, but I think I would make an observation that I think the private sector does tend to look at things pretty smartly. And I would suggest that there will be things that can be learned. I think it's also fair to say, and one of the concerns we had is that some needs for Aucklanders won't be necessarily able to be met through a private sector model. And that's why, even though it was sort of slightly counterintuitive for us to say, you might need to consider,
Interesting.
is there an issue?
Sorry?
Is there an issue?
Sorry, no.
Oh, sorry, okay.
Speaking to the Chief Executive,
Yeah.
sorry, I've got my...
So in some ways it might seem counterintuitive to say, well, hang on, we have to not look at a commercial model. Our concern was accessibility for all, and I think an organisation like this has to consider that. So I think it's definitely worth talking to Sky City and understanding that deal in more detail. I haven't sought that. As I say, this has sort of hit us in the last 10 days too, and we've been more concerned about making sure that they're not sold immediately. But I think the terms of the deal, I think as long as you've got great terms, you could potentially still achieve what you need to do, but we're nowhere near that point now.
Thank you. Councillor Wayne Walker.
I've got a question from you, but I'll just preface it first by saying there might be a simple answer and that might be no. So I'll ask the question. So are you familiar with any planning into the future for the parking requirements for bicycles in the central city? And that includes ordinary bicycles, but also e-bikes, and that also applies to scooters. The docking facilities required for e-cars, that's electric vehicles, shared cars, carpooling, and electric buses, and the docking requirements for those.
Not specifically, but we thought the car parking buildings would be a pretty good bet.
So the short answer is no. And what planning is there for the loss of parking associated with, let's say, the pedestrianisation of Queen Street? That is projected. The pedestrianisation of other streets within the CBD, that is occurring and is projected. And what is the projected requirement for taxis and taxi stands, for mobility parking associated with the growing numbers of disabled in the demographic, and of course the enlarged population that we're seeing in Auckland and its hinterland? The requirements for spaces for waste collection, recycling and the like in the CBD that occur within the street network, and the future requirements for apartment dwellers for which under the unitary plan there is zero provision required largely for parking, and the provision for parking for workers into the CBD into the future along the magnitude that you're projecting, even against a background where there is increased public transport. So what studies are you familiar with around all of those things? And there may be a simple answer.
Well, the irony is we have been involved in discussions about virtually all of those things with both Auckland Council and Auckland Transport, which is why this news hit us. It's sort of so random.
My question is around what studies are there? Is there
Studies.
anything that I or you can turn to around any of
Oh, there will be some work through the, I suspect through the ADO and Auckland Transport as part of the A4E discussion. So yes, I think there will be work
So
available.
where could I find that?
We can talk to you offline and make sure we get some work to you.
Because I'm not aware of
I
it.
think we can deal with that
Right.
offline. I'm quite keen at
Yeah.
this stage. We've got 2 more questions I'm going to accept. I've let this run much longer than usual, but it's because it's an important item on our agenda today. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Viv, thanks for your considered responses and the questions you posed to us. Going straight back to you, so you are now supporting a strategic approach to the look at off-street parking in the city over the next 3, 4, 5 years?
A strategic approach.
To investigation of what is required.
Oh, an investigation,
Yeah.
yes. I didn't think there was a time frame, but it needs to take account of the different stages because we are at a bit of a turning point in the city,
Yeah,
I think,
sure.
and we have to take account of exactly the sort of thing that Councillor Walker was talking about.
And that's be included in that.
Yeah.
My second question is, has Heart of the City done any work? So you're talking about a doubling of the population over the next 10, 15 years as a resident population of the city. Have you done any overlay graphing on that but vehicle movements coming into the city?
Well, Auckland Transport has its projections.
And, do you agree with those? Does Heart of the City agree with those?
Well, it's interesting because we've had a lot of debate recently around vehicle movements through Albert Street, for example. So I can't give you a yes answer because it depends on which data I'm looking at. I mean, we've certainly been probing projections through Albert Street, because one of the issues we've been concerned, it comes back again to that holistic approach, because we've wanted to make sure that the projections that are coming through Auckland Transport are married up with some of the other changes that someone like the Auckland Design Office, the work they do. So it's hard to give you a yes or no answer on that. I mean, I do see lots of projections, but we do accept that public transport is growing and we're incredibly supportive of that, and I think their latest release was fantastic to see that recent increase.
My last question is to do with retail data.
Mm-hmm.
Have you got any information through Heart of the City or through the business work talking about vehicle-driven retail sales as compared to walk-up business sales?
Well, it's interesting because you can get into perceptions. I mean, people tell us that they still have customers coming in by cars. We haven't got data. We research a whole lot of things in retail, but not necessarily the percentage of walk-up versus. But we get data through. I mean, I know the Design Office has data on other cities that have pedestrianised. I mean, I think the case for walking indicates that there is a big productivity gain through people walking through a city. So I think that's fairly well researched. But it does depend on the individual business and their customer base. And I think we've noticed in the last couple of years a significant change around people's like a retailer's perception of somebody walking and somebody having to have a park outside. But we've also got to respect that there are some that, their customers do require cars, which is why we're supportive actually of moving, if you're going to take them off the street, put them into a car parking building. That's a perfectly valid strategy if we're trying to pedestrianise certain streets. So hard to give you a direct answer on that because it does depend on the individual business circumstances. But overall, the productivity gains from walking is what I think is researched.
My last point would be thank you for accepting my colleague here's comments about calling our infrastructure provisions into the city a lemon. I'm sure he actually meant a very good juicy apple tree rather than lemons.
Right. Last question, Councillor Pennyhouse.
And the Deputy Mayor kindly, in his second question, asked mine. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. That's excellent. I'll move the motion, Viv, to receive and thank you for your presentation today. Happy to second Councillor Fletcher. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Thank you very much.